tonight we've got historian Dan Cohn. He's going to talk about the Burrell School. But first off, again, thank you for being here. And I'd also like to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance. They have helped us do Cultural Crossroads for about 20 years now. Is that right, Elijah? I'm saying 20 years, but I'm not totally. Right. Yeah. They've been helping us do this for about 20 years. Then they're the Alabama Humanities Foundation. Now they're the Humanities Alliance. So I really appreciate their help with the funding to put this together so that we as the Landmarks Foundation can continue to offer kind of a pretty high level of opportunities, educational opportunities for folks looking at Alabama history. Also with us, we have Elijah Gaddis. He's a professor at Auburn and a board member, the vice president for the board of the Landmarks Foundation, and he's going to introduce Dan.
Excellent. Thanks, Collier. And yeah, thanks to, I'm glad you said Alabama Humanities Alliance, because I had in my head that the name had changed, but I knew I was going to bungle it. We're really excited to welcome Dan Cohn, Dr. Dan Cohn, who I've known since before he was a doctor, to the Cultural Crossroads Reconstruction and its Legacies speaker series tonight. Dan has a PhD from Auburn University in the department where I have the great good fortune to teach. In fact, he let me sit on his dissertation committee as a member. In fact, I think even though I had trouble remembering Dan's title for tonight, I think I can actually remember the title of his dissertation, which I believe is The Cause Archived, Thomas M. Owen and the Preservation of Confederate Memory, or somewhere around there, which is really wonderful. Yeah, which is a really wonderful dissertation about exactly that, the founding of the Alabama Archives, a really important sort of hallmark of public history in not only Alabama, but throughout the nation. Since he's finished his PhD, Dan is working still as an instructor, faculty member at Auburn University, where he teaches world history and a variety of other things. And he's also more appropriate for tonight, a project archivist for the National Park Service, and currently working among other things with them on a project about Reconstruction era education, a very, very important topic that is still understudied, and which this study is going to really sort of broaden our understanding of. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dan Cohn. There are many other things I could say about him. I even have all his books and publications listed here, but he's a person to talk tonight, not me, and he'll be addressing us tonight on the Burrell School, hopefully I got the name right, Black Belt Beacon. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Dr. Gaddis. Good evening to everyone who's tuning in this evening. A few apologies and disclaimers are in order before I start. First of all, the fact that you can't see me very well is due to the fact that the light bulb in my desk lamp burned out literally moments before I got onto this Zoom call, so I did not have time to replace it. So unfortunately, you're just seeing my silhouette, which is probably a good thing. I'm not much to look at. The other thing I have to note is that while I have been fortunate to have helped Dr. Keith Hebert in the public history department at Auburn University with this research in African American education in the postbellum and Reconstruction eras, he is by far much more of an expert in this than I am. My role in this has largely been editorial, although I have done a little bit of research on the side, particularly in terms of the school that we're discussing this evening. So although I don't normally do this, I think it's probably for the best to read you the summary that Dr. Hebert and I put together for the Burrell School, because it will go much better than if I were simply to extemporaneous extemporize, on this particular topic. And I consider this far too important to simply wing it. So forgive me if I go by what is written. So let's get started. There's a picture of the Burrell School. Fortunate to have found one picture of it. As you might imagine, it's quite difficult to find pictures of any number of African-American schools for this period, but very fortunate to have found this one in a primary source. Founded in 1869, the Burrell Academy is one of the oldest Black public schools in Alabama and the first Black public school in Selma. Operated through the combined support of the American Missionary Association and the Selma Board of Education, Burrell provided all levels of education from grade school to industrial. Association turned Burrell into a private institution. The following year, Selma created the Clark School, now Clark Elementary School, to serve other Black students. Although in 1900, fire destroyed the original Burrell School, the American Missionary Association continued the school's legacy through the Burrell Normal School, which ran from 1903 to 1969 in Florence. Several mid-19th century buildings that once housed Burrell faculty and students have survived, and Clark remains a central component of Selma's African-American community. Situated on a bluff above the Alabama River in the Black Belt region, Selma was the regional center of an antebellum economic and social order dependent on Black enslaved labor and cotton cultivation. During the Civil War, the Confederate government relocated war industries to Selma for protection, but in late March and early April 1865, during the final weeks of the fighting, the United States Army captured and destroyed most of the city. War-ravaged Selma had no African-American schools. Therefore, on December 30th, 1865, Selma's Free People published an appeal to the city's white community to support Black education. They urged wounded Confederate veterans and widows to put aside their prejudices and teach the city's largely illiterate Black community, while warning that failure to act would play into the hands of hated outsiders like the radical Republicans. If you stand back, this appeal cautioned, strangers, i.e. Northerners, will come in and take the money from under your hands and carry it away to build up their own country. They are not ashamed to make money from any class of men. At the same time, Selma's Black community turned to the federally supported Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, for assistance. Headquartered in Montgomery under the command of General Wager Swain, the Alabama branch of the Bureau kept an office in Selma to coordinate operations west of the capital. Although schools were an important part of the Bureau's operations, it organized numerous Black school boards, stimulated fundraising campaigns, and provided limited external funds, Bureau agents nonetheless oversaw a large area with limited resources, poor roads, and slow communications. The Selma office, therefore, had to devote most of its time to mitigating labor disputes between freed people and white landowners and investigating outbreaks of interracial violence. Consequently, the Bureau often tried to shift the burdens of founding new schools and hiring teachers to local communities of freed people. Apart from private homes and churches, the Freedmen's Bureau attempted to create temporary schools in vacant properties. Regrettably, most abandoned buildings in Selma were in severe disrepair and lacked proper lighting. In one instance, while investigating the old Confederate carriage shop, United States Army officer Captain Joseph Groves reported that before it could be used as a schoolhouse, the carriage shop's roof, doors, floorings, and rafters would have to be replaced and a new stove installed, for which funds were scarce. Reasoning that an imperfect building was better than none, the Bureau patched up the carriage shop's worst areas sealing leaks and patching large cracks in the siding, then opened it for classes. On the other hand, only after freed people had purchased known as Little Zion Church in 1866 did military carpenters report that the Bureau's $150 budget for repairs was insufficient, which scuttled plans to use the church as a schoolhouse and community center. Moreover, restoring vacant buildings often proved risky when owners returned to reclaim their properties, although in the case of the carriage shop, local courts determined that no one held a property title. Renting housing for teachers was no less challenging. Initially, the Bureau provided salaries and rental stipends. Reported, there was less money available to build new schools for freed people. Starting in the summer of 1867, the Bureau began to shift rental expenses onto benevolent societies. By the same token, inadequate or non-existent teacher housing slowed the development of many schools. Informed of the difficulties, some teachers delayed moving to Selma for months. Others asked the Bureau to simply send them home. One success for the Bureau and the Black community was the creation of Selma's first Black school in the basement of the First Baptist Church. Joseph Sears, a 28-year-old American Army veteran, Yale graduate, and American Missionary Association member, was hired to manage the school, assisted by teachers H.C. Coe, Carrie E. Smith, and Marietta Morrill. Monthly funding from the Bureau for what newspapers called, quote, Mr. Sears Colored School amounted to $50 per teacher and $40 per rented classroom. Unhappy with the superintendent's credentials, white church members suspended operations and asked Sears to leave. Freed people, in turn, left the church and formed an independent congregation. Meanwhile, 3 additional privately funded schools opened. Freed woman Lucy Gee taught classes in a tent. A white woman named Hubbard taught in an abandoned Confederate building. And New England-born Congregationalist clergyman John Silsby organized a classroom in a Black church member's carpentry shop. Sears and Silsby, in fact, were central to the development of Black public education in Alabama. At the 1867 State Constitutional Convention, Silsby lobbied to fund public schools and create a school board. To create a state school board. While Sears served on the State Board of Education, helped establish the Lincoln Normal College and University in Montgomery, the state's first public Black university, and served as Selma's first superintendent of public schools. For Selma, Silsby and Sears pulled out all the stops, soliciting financial support from the American Missionary Association's largest donor, Jabez Burrell of Ohio. Against the few $100s donated by the Freedmen's Bureau and a committee of white citizens led by Confederate General Edmund Pettus, Burrell donated a princely sum, $10,000, to the construction of the school that ultimately bore his name. The largest buildings in Selma. According to resident John Hardy, it stood, quote, 2 stories high, with dimensions of 50 by 64 feet, containing 5 schoolrooms, 1 recitation room, and a chapel capable of seating 350 people. On Friday, April 9th, 1869, African-American children announced the school's grand opening with a triumphal procession from downtown to the front doors. The city's school board reluctantly agreed to fund the academy, but continued to harbor distrust of its northern faculty and administrators, especially because Sears, Burrell, which was one of the few Black high schools in Alabama, became the pride and joy of Selma's African-American community, particularly its middle class. Approximately 35% of all Black students in Dallas County attended the academy, as did hundreds of Black boarding students from across the state. 2 years into its operation, the Selma Board of Education reported, quote, in the Burrell schools, 8 teachers are employed for 8 months at a cost of $555 per month, and about 475 scholars attended. The Burrell Academy had an impact outside for in the first 10 years of operation, more than 30 graduates taught in local Black schools. The school also trained Black clergy, especially Congregationalist ministers. Several graduates even became foreign missionaries for the American Missionary Association across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. More than an educational center, Burrell hosted visiting lecturers, ministers, elected officials, government officers, and the city's Black Temperance Society and Business Club. Although served the Black community, the Academy also became an inviting cultural venue for white citizens. During the 1870s and 1880s, Burrell sponsored a student symphony orchestra and an annual commencement program that often included recitations, chorale performances, and craft and mechanical demonstrations, all of which drew large multiracial crowds. In addition, Academy principals, teachers, and students often appeared at the city's largest auditorium, Gilman's Hall. Yet white resident support for Burrell had its limits. Publicly, the all-white city applauded the quality of its curriculum and the fiscal responsibility of its administration. Privately, however, many white residents opposed Burrell, spread slander that African American politicians and community leaders used the school as a front to steal public tax dollars, and harassed the Northern women who taught there. Nor did critics approve of the Academy's tie to the Congregationalist Church or its faculty and supervisors, who hailed from Pennsylvania, Maine, Ohio, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. In 1875, unidentified white men accused Burrell Academy teachers of proselytizing the children, running the school in the interest of the Congregationalist Church, lecturing and even punishing pupils for not attending the Sabbath school. Strangely, when the school board seized control of Burrell from the American Missionary Association, it retained the Academy's carpetbagger staff, but dramatically decreased the school's budget and programs. Soon, the American Missionary Association struck back. In 1889, after hearing complaints from Black parents, the organization ended its lease agreement with Selma and restructured the Burrell Academy as a private school funded by Northern donations and tuition fees. Unfortunately, this transition ended up costing Selma's Black children an entire year of schooling. The next year, a new Black public school, Clark, opened a few blocks west of Burrell. Unlike the Academy, the Clark School's teachers and administrators were predominantly Southern-born African Americans without connections to the American Missionary Association. By this time, Jim Crow segregation was in full swing. State legislation permitted local school boards to allocate most education funds to white schools. Although Black schools had been economically starved for decades, the new laws further reduced operating expenses and salaries. Teachers, for instance, now earned 25% less than their white counterparts, and the board all but eliminated Black industrial training and high school programs. Nevertheless, Selma's Black community rallied in support of the school through their own means. During the early 20th century, under the leadership of Principal Richard B. Hudson, Clark, at least, did retain some funding as its programs emphasized vocational training that did not openly contest segregation. Fire destroyed the Burrell Academy building in 1900, and only a handful of its late 19th century teachers today. Yet Clark School occupies the original Clark School's location. Clark Elementary School today occupies the Clark School's original location. After the loss in Selma, the American Missionary Association donated a new Burrell Normal School in Florence in 1903, which had operated for 34 years until handing the school over to the Florence City Board of Education. Renamed Burrell High, the school was combined with Slater Elementary in 1951 to become Burrell Slater High School. When Florence schools integrated in 1939, Burrell Slater High closed as Black students were sent to the city's existing high school. Today, a 1960s school building in Florence is all that survives of the Burrell Normal School, the Black beacon of Selma. Thank you.
I meant to unmute myself. That was great. Thank you. I wondered if folks have questions, you can chime in the chat, and I can give them to Dr. Cohn. I wanted to just ask a couple quick sort of things, if you could. So this series is about Reconstruction more broadly. And I think the Burrell School offers a really interesting example, right, of one of the kind of projects of Reconstruction being Black education. So I wondered if you could, from the work that you've been doing and thinking about some, if you could give us a little bit more of a sense of where either public or private Black education fit into the kind of political project of Reconstruction in Alabama. Big question, I know, but I'm interested in the broad strokes here.
Well, I think broadly it fit in a sense wherever the principals involved, the principal actors involved, I should have said, meant it to fit in. And it depends entirely on who you're talking about. Obviously, it's a means of trying to realize the promise afforded by the 14th and 15th Amendments, trying to create and something approximating a multiracial Southern social order, or at least moving towards that direction from the perspective of African Americans. Certainly, there's the aspirational desire, particularly as I said, amongst Selma's middle class, who largely patronized the Burrell Academy, not just to belong in a social sense, but to prove that they truly were middle class. And cynically, on the other side of on the ex-Confederate side of the spectrum, it's, I think, a more nuanced understanding of African American education in the immediate postbellum years is, it's at least a token that these, supposedly New South, but often quite unreconstructed Southern leaders could say, well, we're doing something. Here's a good example. Look how supportive we're being of these handful of schools. How generous we are with letting them operate, and contributing a pittance, but it's still some money towards keeping them going. So clearly we're accepting of this new social order imposed by the war and imposed by Northern occupation. So this proves that we have the best interests of Selma's African American community, and of course African Americans in Alabama more broadly. We have their best interest at heart. So no need to keep looking over our shoulders back, and we'll handle this. So it's, it could serve all of those purposes, depending on who was involved. And obviously those are ultimately cross purposes, because continuing with that the last group of actors there, what former Confederates really wanted was to get control of these schools, and if not necessarily to get rid of them, to at least shrink them down to something much more manageable and firmly under their control. So different purposes depending on who's. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. That actually, kind of gets to another thing I was thinking about. You said at the beginning this, you shared with us some excerpts from that really fascinating appeal on the part of the sort of Black communities, right, to white people in Selma, right, asking for this kind of patronage. And so I mean, I wonder where that fits into this broader kind of reconstruction of social life, right? That there's still that kind of appeal to, noblesse oblige, I guess, right?
Mhm.
And how that sort of evolves over time in Selma, or even more broadly, perhaps in the Black Belt. So a question you started answering, I think, but.
Yeah. It's I've seen a few. I think I saw one of those in the dissertation, actually. A similar appeal. One of the things that Thomas Owen thought was worth preserving or sending on to Walter Fleming for his book on Reconstruction Alabama was, it wasn't for education, but it was a similar sort of appeal from the quote colored citizens of a certain Alabama city or town. I can't remember what it was, and it's striking how similar the language is. And again, it could be read, and I think scholars have read these sorts of appeals in many ways. You can read it if you're inclined to as a continuation of this paternalistic, cap in hand, petitioning to and deferring to our betters, crouching, cringing at the extreme end sort of, social behavior that certainly would have been inculcated from years of slavery and inequality in antebellum society. You can certainly see it as that. See it as African Americans in Selma, knowing that they're the ex-Confederates still to some degree held the levers of power, and at least in some cases still had some money, and sort of cynically realized, well, we need to get the money, we need to get the support, so we don't have a problem telling them maybe what they want to hear, what they would be accustomed to hearing from us. This crouching, cringing, submissive kind of thing. Yeah, we'll tell them that, long as it gets us what we need. Or, a third way is you can simply read this as a means of psychic and, maybe just plain physical survival, you know, realizing that even with the supposedly new social order that was going to be created by the war and created by Reconstruction, on the day to day and on a local basis, they're, the former enemies of, the freed people still held a certain amount of power, a certain amount of influence. And so we have to, at least sound as if we're willing to play by the old rules just to get by.
Yeah.
So
No,
many different ways to read those sorts of appeals, but fascinating
yeah,
how often
yeah.
they show up.
I think it's exactly right. Right. It's such an interesting historical challenge, right? As we're thinking about this source material, right? How actually to read it, right? Rather than take it sort of on its face, or to dig a little bit more into what seems to be subtext there. And I've got another question sort of related to this, but Randall Williams has a really good question here, which I'd love for you to take a stab at. He asked, what comparisons or distinctions would you draw between the attitudes of the white religionists in the AMA or other affiliated denomination, who are mostly Northern, and the Southern white religionists, in terms of the fundamentals of or support for educating African Americans?
Well, I think probably the best work that I've read on that, and which went a ways to informing, editing and reading several of these different studies for African American schools in the postbellum period, was the work of Ronald. I'm afraid I'm going to butcher his last name, but it's Butchart, Butchart. He's or Booktart. I can't, not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but he's written several books specifically about uh, the AMA and how its critical role in these schools. And he would contend that although to some degree there many of the AMA missionaries and teachers and former Confederates shared some of the same paternalistic attitude towards African Americans that, it's up to us to teach them, that they don't really know anything. So we have to take on this burden of improving their lives because, they can't do it themselves. Although that, to be sure, does show up, I think Butchart would also argue that the AMA's, if not necessarily its leadership, certainly it's the educators, and he gives very, very good examples of this, realized and put into writing their firm belief that African American students intellectually were just as capable as white students of not only learning what would be considered the rudiments of late 19th century education, but also thinking abstractly and thinking conceptually, absorbing the sorts of things that education is supposed to provide, not to just teach you stuff to remember, but to actually teach you how to think. AMA teachers, he's demonstrated, and I think it probably would be no less true of Burrell, certainly, said their students, they picked this stuff up. They didn't need us to, spoon feed them, anything. At the most we provided them some sort of discipline and regimen for day-to-day lives. Not that they didn't already have some of that from, the experience of plantation economy, but they already had the means. And AMA educators actually tried to make this clear to the AMA leadership. These students really know how to do, all and more that we could ever wish for, but the leadership tended to take a more conservative view of it. So, we don't necessarily need higher education initiatives for African American children. We teach them just the basics, and then we've done our job. So I see there kind of being this dichotomy. I think it actually kind of plays out in the case of the Burrell School, with the AMA willing to sort of backtrack on its earlier support, to some degree, in the interest of appeasing the white critics in Selma. That there was division within that organization about just how far this should go, and the educators, by and large, seem to be willing to go further than the leadership.
Yeah, that's such an interesting story, right? That they have institutions on the one hand, and then what actually happens on the ground is different. Mm-hmm. We have another really great question here from Hannah Garman, kind of on the other sort of end of this period in some ways, and she asked, can you discuss something about the connection between these types of educational institutions during this sort of emergent period of Jim Crow, and how they might have worked together with other types of sources for funding, such as something that's more well known, Rosenwald school funds. So thinking about these types of schools and where they meet or don't, perhaps with other models of community funding like the Rosenwalds.
Well, I'm going to display my ignorance for all to see. I'm not exactly sure what the Rosenwald School Fund is, and I probably just shot myself in the foot there. So maybe if you could explain a little bit, that would help.
So Rosenwald's sort of come around a bit later, right? And they are another kind of tool of Northern philanthropists. In this case, Julius Rosenwald, one of the founders, I believe, of Sears Roebuck. Someone can correct me on that later, or Wes can edit that out if I'm wrong. All right, who have this kind of model of self-sufficiency and sort of self-determination, in that they were, putting up part of the funds for these really kind of modern school buildings. They had these wonderful designs in terms of really allowing in lots of light and fresh air and all these kinds of things. but also ensuring, right, that the African American communities themselves were putting up some of the money for the school buildings as a way of kind of claiming them. So, Hannah didn't ask the question to me, but it seems like a really interesting evolution from what you're talking about earlier, right? Where we're seeing this sort of dependence, or as I think you really rightly put it, this kind of quasi-dependence on white Southern support, right? To instead seeing, maybe with the Rosenwalds, a continued sort of philanthropic support, but a philanthropic support that really encouraged something like at least self-sufficiency. And I think I think you've made me sort of think throughout this talk that those are less at cross purposes, these two models that we're talking about, than I would have thought kind of at the beginning of your talk, certainly. So there's my stab at the question. I have a couple other things, and other folks will hopefully chime in as we begin to wrap up here. But maybe slightly kind of still sort of bigger questions, but bringing us a little beyond education. So, and sort of relating these to the talks we've had before. So last week we had a wonderful talk from British English, professor at Alabama State, who just put out a wonderful book last year, Civil War, Civil Rights, Civil Bodies, I think, which is on the experience of Reconstruction in Perry County. Given that you've got the black belt beacon kind of in your title, I wondered if you could say anything about what the Burrell School kind of suggests for us about the specifics of Reconstruction as it unfolded in the Black Belt of Alabama, if anything.
Well, that's interesting. I would, from looking at Burrell, I would say that if it demonstrates anything about the Black Belt, it would demonstrates it unfolded. First of all, that it unfolded with less violence than one might expect. Certainly, with the example of this school, it's notable looking through the sources for the development of this school, how little violent backlash, in terms of actual, physical violence and harassment there actually was. Certainly, as I said, that many of the teachers, many of the northern white women were personas non grata, in the community amongst the white Selmans, and certainly, of course, ultimately the state and city school boards ended up turning off the spigot of financial support. But there was not here the same degree of, I'll just say it, white Selmans wanting to burn down the school and lynch the students. And you see that elsewhere. The Storer College, as a counterexample, in Harper's Ferry, a border state, and practically right on the doorstep of the free states, nonetheless experienced a lot of that, to the point where they were concerned. They thought, within a few years after Reconstruction started, we're going to have to shut this whole thing down because our students are getting shot at. Our teachers are getting shot at. They're people, local boys are breaking the windows, and we've had threats of arson and all sorts of things, which is, certainly the backlash reactions that you read about plenty in Reconstruction, but you don't really see that in Burrell. You would think that it would have been constant, given that this is the Black Belt, the center of the old plantation economy, and yet you don't see that here. And I have to kind of wonder why, and I'm not sure entirely. Is it that this particular group, of white Alabamians was willing to play at least a little bit nicer for a while? And if so, why exactly was that? So that's one thing that definitely stands out. That's I think makes this an interesting is how little of that violent backlash there was. Um, I guess another sort of thing is this demonstrates the unevenness of how Reconstruction unfolded, which is not an earth-shattering thing to claim, but it's for the very example of having to find space for educational facilities. We have to find someplace. Well, there are these few places, but they need serious repairs. Okay, well, we repair them. Oh, well, turns out now you don't have the money to actually fulfill the repairs, so we're going to have to stop that and go somewhere else. Okay, well, then we'll find this other building. Oh, well, then we'll take you to court over the title, who owns this thing. So it's just back and forth, and yet in the midst of all of that, with it should be noted, very little support from the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's largely, of course, the fact that, as you well know, the Freedmen's Bureau had lofty aspirations and goals and was never bankrolled to the degree that it could have realistically carried out even a fraction of the stuff that it was supposed to have carried out. Despite lacking that kind of real support from the federal government, the fact that they managed to, the African American middle class managed to keep this school going all through, Jim Crow and into really with Clark into the end of segregation. So resiliency and unevenness and kind of a wild ride, which is, I guess, it's sort of interesting to present that alongside the typical story of Reconstruction, because the typical story of Reconstruction so often is the same thing, a noble but fated and ultimately destined to fail project on the larger scale, perhaps. But I think we also have to realize and point out the little victories, like establishing Burrell and keeping it going. So that's kind of what I see.
Yeah, no, that is a particularly fantastic point, I think, right? That we measure the failure of Reconstruction on the sort of level, a systemic level, right, or a region-wide or national level. But if we think about individual communities, individual places, then perhaps it helps us rethink not only that sort of dichotomy of success versus failure of Reconstruction, but also one of the organizing principles of this series, right, which is Reconstruction and its legacies. So really thinking about how those are multiple, right? Those legacies of how these unfold, and they differ from place to place. So okay, one more question, and kind of relating it back to the series as a whole. I mentioned last week we had Burtis English talk to us about Friedman's conventions and a little bit about the Black Belt, his own book. We began this series with Michael Fitzgerald, who, of course, has written the fullest study of Reconstruction in Alabama since Fleming's
the antidote to Fleming.
Yeah, right. The century and 20 years or something later, antidote to Fleming. And Mike was really useful, I think, in kicking us off to think about the broad contours of Reconstruction, both history and historiography in Alabama. So I wondered if we could end by my asking you another broad question, which was, what does the study of Black education add to our understanding of Reconstruction in Alabama?
That's a very, very broad question. Well, I think it adds a critical story, which to me, surprisingly, even after the, revisionist school and the new revisionist school and all that they've contributed, including what Michael Fitzgerald is contributing. And I would hazard a guess that he would kind of agree with this. It's a story that still really doesn't get told that much. It's the story of Reconstruction is still largely, the story of political machinations at the highest level, and Congress versus Johnson, and the various state conventions, and that, and stolen elections, which of course is a very pertinent topic right now. Or I should say questions about that sort of thing. And yet African American education really doesn't get that much of a mention. I don't think often in considerations of Reconstruction. The focus is usually on political mobilization of freed people. Certainly a critical issue, but I would contend one where claims of victory are even more tenuous than here. I think with education, you can make the argument again on a local and case by case basis for a lot of success that you can't really make in the political sphere. So again, it's an attempt, I think, when you bring in education, you add sort of lights and hues to the overall somber picture of Reconstruction as it actually unfolded. You get at least a little bit of delineation, a little bit of light in the and the fact that this was largely self-developed, self-funded, certainly Jabez Burrell contributed his, $10,000. I'm sure it helped a lot, but over the long haul, funding for buildings, funding for teachers, and all that sort of thing was born out of the grit and the bare thin pocketbooks of the people involved who didn't have very much to begin with when the war was done, and yet, and this is Ronald Bouchart's point, and I think it's a very apt one. And yet, despite all that they lacked, having practically nothing, they were nonetheless able to do things like keep Burrell Academy going, when by all rights it should have folded, and many other institutions like it in Alabama and in the former Confederate states. So resiliency, in spite of tremendous odds. I think that's what we get.
I think that's a great lesson to take away. Anybody that studies American history, and especially Reconstruction era history, and especially African American Reconstruction era history, knows that there are very often a few triumphs to take from this, or at least that is what the story has been for a long time. It's also a good segue for me to say that regretfully, we'll be talking about the darker side of Reconstruction in Alabama for next in this series. I'll be in conversation with Cedric Weich about lynching and racial violence during the Reconstruction period in Alabama. Also a topic that I think is very worthy of study, though without even the limited happy endings that we might see here. So we hope everyone will join us for that in a couple of weeks. That's going to be on April the 1st, and we'll put out information about that soon. For now, I want to thank Dan Cohn for giving us a fun talk, and for putting up with my asking him a bunch of questions. So
my pleasure.
We have the typical applause because everyone's behind a screen and invisible. But thanks very much for doing this, Dan. It was
thank you.
a pleasure. All right, thanks. Have a good night.